And good evening. It is 8:13 a.m. on Monday, September 15th, halfway through the month, 2025. Mark Kulak, Housatonic.live, and this is an archival video done by an archival show. We are going to be playing a May 7th, 2022 podcast. It's audio only of current Director of Health and Human Services in the United States of America, RFK Jr., from when he was, I think at that time, he was, of course, he's always identified with Children's Health Defense. I don't know if he was still with them or if he had left to participate in his electoral presidential run by that time. The person he's interviewing and having a discussion with is Hillary Johnson. The title is Biomedical Research Gone Awry with Hillary Johnson. It's only a 33-minute podcast. It's pretty short. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes going over why I am presenting this and I want to archive it. Hillary Johnson is a name that's, most people are just not familiar with the name. They don't immediately recognize it or connect it with books. So it's a easy to overlook show. Hillary Johnson is a journalist and book author. She got her career started with I forget the name of the publication, but most of her big publications were with the very famous magazine Rolling Stone throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and even early 2000s. The work that she is most well known for is ME CFS, chronic fatigue. ME is myalgic encephalomyelitis. And she was on ABC Primetime and other shows talking about the breakout of chronic fatigue in near Lake Tahoe. It's known as the Incline Village, Lake Tahoe. Chronic fatigue breakout, and which happened around 1983, 1984, and became known as somewhat of a subject matter expert on chronic fatigue. The book that she wrote, Osler's Web, which I think was published in 1996, which you just captured, Inside the Labyrinth of Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, or The Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Epidemic. It is a very long book, 750 pages, well-sourced. And remember, my podcasting career, the two main things which motivated it, one was the drug epidemic, fatal drug overdoses in the United States of America, which was throughout the 2000 teens, largely still unrecognized or is vastly underreported within the United States. And the other one was Lyme disease and chronic fatigue syndrome. And my knowledge of what these things are and are not has vastly changed since then. Either way, they both had major impacts on my family, which led me to be more curious about why these things were being so misunderstood and considered taboo subjects. So I appreciate the work that she did to raise awareness of these. I'm not sure if I would completely agree with all of her conclusions, but that's irrelevant here because what we're doing here is capturing this particular podcast. Now, the scientist in Pennsylvania, she actually did go to the University of Pennsylvania, and she did a lot of work at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia, who is perhaps one of the most dominant names mentioned in this book, is a Dr. Elaine de Freitas, who is no longer active. And she was a top understudy and protege of Dr. Hillary Kaprowski, Hillary Kaprowski is known to be the first person to develop and use a polio vaccine, and that was back in 1953, 1954. Very controversial because it was an oral polio vaccine. In fact, he was motivated to make an oral polio vaccine because he saw a lot of neurological side effects, polio-ish, some might even say, from an intramuscularly injected rabies vaccine. Now, if you look at his record, Hillary Kaprowski would not be described as someone who has a lifelong battle against intramuscular injection. But it is noteworthy that many of his most outstanding and noteworthy accomplishments seem to be oral vaccines. And if you look at the people who admired him, even Stanley Plotkin, who gets a very bad rap, he seems to have a bend towards oral vaccines, or, such as in the case of Inovio, vaccines which are implemented via electroporation. Very curious how all these things seem to tie together, and maybe, I don't know, autoimmune issues with the body developing immunity against perhaps something to do with its own muscles via the intramuscular injection. And there's a lot of other potential scenarios involved there, but I'm not going to get too much further in that. Elaine de Freitas, I think, is the person who inspired the work, or was asked to be the inspiration of, Dr. Judy Mikovits. Judy Mikovits, when she left her job at the National Cancer Institute and went out to Nevada, of all places, right next to where that breakout happened, and worked at the Whittemore Peterson Institute, this was her thing as well, focusing on the chronic fatigue syndrome, the ME/CFS. There have been many suggestions that perhaps the same things, the same virus, the same cause, which was behind this increased reporting of chronic fatigue, might also be this identical to AIDS. Hillary Johnson proposes that, but I don't think that she actually believed that either. So I don't believe that. There's nothing to suggest here, just to let you know, a little bit of a spoiler, that Hillary Johnson is knowingly spreading any type of disinformation or whatever. However, it's very possible that she could be being used as part of a something much bigger. Maybe she's aware of it. I don't know. It's very interesting, though. But it's definitely important to note that when you really get into the study of chronic fatigue syndrome, the HIV and AIDS just keep popping up. They keep popping up. Now, although Elaine de Freitas, I don't believe is ever mentioned here by name, Judy Mikovits became one of the key scientists backing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. She rose to prominence and visibility very early in the pandemic. Although I don't think she was ever formally part of Children's Health Defense, you could see her on a lot of videos and sort of in the same orbit and so on. So I don't think that's any coincidence. I don't think that's any coincidence at all. No one but me has stated the painfully obvious fact that the attempt to link chronic fatigue syndrome to a retrovirus is a pursuit that was uniquely shared by both Elaine de Freitas and Judy Mikovits. And crazier still, the virus that Elaine de Freitas, again understudy of Hillary Kaprowski, was suggesting might be behind the chronic fatigue was HTLV3, which was co-discovered by Judy Mikovits' longtime mentor, Francis Ruschetti, also at the National Cancer Institute. There's a whole lot more backstory to all of these things, which would take hours and hours to review. There's another author out there who's still substacking as a prominent voice on chronic fatigue syndrome. Her work is also connected now and being promoted and supported by Children's Health Defense. As a matter of fact, that person is Nina Ostrom, and you can find some of her older works in such as What Really Killed Gilda Radner. Gilda Radner is known as a very famous American comedian and had a relationship with Danny DeVito. So, without any further ado, I'm just going to play the video, and then we are going to close out this session afterwards. Thank you for listening, and if you're listening to this, you are amongst an elite group of researchers and archivists and on the internet. And I also think, especially given the day, September 15th, 2025, Good for you for keeping your eye on the ball. It takes many, many years to get to where we are, and not getting too caught up in all of the passion of the moment and other things, which are encouraging people to just be angrier and angrier. So good for you for being here and thinking long term. All right, let's cue it up and have a great day.
Hey everybody, my guest today is journalist Hillary Johnson. Miss Johnson is a medical writer. She has written for 3 decades on many, many subjects.
I'm sorry, one more thing. Hillary Johnson also did a very large article in Rolling Stone in 2003 regarding depleted uranium, which is just that one extra article. Is like, okay, so there's definitely a thread of Hillary Johnson, Rolling Stone, etc. I think she may also have had collaboration with Matt Taibbi, and Matt Taibbi is involved in with the Brett Weinsteins and the promotion of their what's it called? Plan 3 or Plan 30 or Plan B, which is often referenced, and the new party started by the Weinsteins, etc. I'm just throwing out a lot of metadata right there. I haven't quite sorted it all out. However, though, once you see the breadth of the work that Hillary Johnson has participated in Rolling Stone, it's now you know why I've picked this particular podcast to highlight and to archive. So let me restart again, and now for real, I'm going to disappear.
Hey everybody, my guest today is journalist Hillary Johnson. Miss Johnson is a medical writer. She has written for 3 decades on many, many subjects that are right in the kind of wheelhouse of my interest, including the retroviral cocktails that went in that became AIDS treatments like AZT. You've also written about the use of depleted uranium weapons by the United States in the Gulf Wars, about public health posed by ever-mutating flu viruses, about viral causes of multiple sclerosis, about air pollution-induced mortality, health effects from Love Canal, which is one of the places where I got my start. Her most in-depth reporting has been about the U.S. biomedical research going sour in the case of myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is also called chronic fatigue syndrome. Her science reporting has been published in Rolling Stone, where she was a contributing editor for a decade, in Mirabella, in Life, in Self, the New York Times, Working Women, and many, many more. Well, welcome to the show, Hillary.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Let's talk about chronic fatigue syndrome, because the reason I wanted to get you on here is I read your book, and you can see this is my dog-eared and heavily annotated copy, and you've really done an incredible service by writing this. Show us the copy of your book, because you have the same thing.
Yes, here's my book. It seems to be just as, well, it couldn't be more dog-eared than it is. Virtually every other page. Oh, I've had this book in my possession for about 20 years now. It was published in 1996. But everything in it, I mean, so little has changed since then. But
both our books, for those of you who are listening on podcasts, have at least, I would say, 50 or 60 post-its that are hanging out in various configurations. So tell us about it, because obviously I've read your book. And
yes. Well, I did want to say up top that I think I would be remiss not to say that the phrase chronic fatigue syndrome is a name that was really conjured up by the Centers for Disease Control in 1988. They came out with it. It was that long ago. But it was a name that was really conjured to cover up the severity of this disease, which actually for decades prior to 88 was known as myalgic encephalomyelitis. And let's call it ME to keep it simple.
But let me interrupt you for a second. It was also popularly called yuppie flu. It was back in the 80s when it people started first taking notice of it, it was seen mainly in women, and it was often attributed to the incapacity of women to perform corporate type jobs. And this was at the beginning of the women's liberation movement, when women were beginning to step into Wall Street and other positions of business responsibility. And the psychiatric profession and the National Health, Public Health Services blamed this on women. So, that's part of the history.
Yes, it was a very punishing name, and I'm kind of overwhelmed because everything you're saying, there's so much to respond to. But I think a general statement that is true is that one of the reasons this disease has been so ignored, covered up, lied about, funding has been withheld, etc., is that it is a disease of women. Now, there are going to be a few men who'll be mad at me for saying that. Certainly men do get this disease, but statistically, it's very well known and documented that women get this disease in a ratio of 3 to 1, 4 to 1. Could be as many as 80% of people who suffer this disease are women. And to get back to the name, now yuppie flu was just a jokey name dreamt up by a Newsweek headline writer. Had nothing to do with the real disease, actually. But to get back to chronic fatigue syndrome, this was a disease that, this was a name that was dreamt up over a period of a year through a snail mail consultation of a couple of people at CDC and a few, maybe a handful of doctors around the country who either had never seen anybody with this disease or had maybe seen a few. In other words, the people who created chronic fatigue syndrome didn't really know anything about the disease. The point was, really, it was almost like corporate messaging or corporate branding to put the CDC's brand on this disease and to basically obfuscate the severity of the disease. I'll just, shock you and say that this is very likely a transmissible infectious disease, and it can be lethal. People do die of it. The morbidity is simply unknown. People have no concept whatsoever of how terrible this disease is. It's a disease that destroys your brain, your heart. It's an immune deficiency, and it's just a really tragic event that has occurred. And I think one of the biggest misnomers about ME is that it's mysterious and very little is known about it. And in fact, it's not mysterious and a lot is known about it. You just would never know that because NIH and CDC have kept such a tight grip on information about ME. And it's very interesting to me that I've watched for literally decades now, the CDC and the NIH, especially the NIH, and it all leads to Fauci, I might add. They've exerted a tremendous desire to control the information about this disease and to basically sculpt it into something that it's not. We can elaborate on that if you wish.
One of the threats to the public health service on this disease was that it appeared at the same time as HIV/AIDS, and that there were a number of scientists out there who said this is actually the same disease. That when a gay person gets it, it's called HIV/AIDS. When a woman gets it, it's called chronic fatigue syndrome. And there are serious scientists then and today that still believe that may be the case. So give us your take on that.
Well, I do not believe they are the same disease. AIDS, essentially, but I will concede, and this is an incredibly important point, that they emerged concurrently. as epidemics in the late 70s, early 1980s. And in fact, there was a very distinguished infectious disease specialist who gave a talk at CDC in 1983 or 84 that was very well attended in an auditorium filled with CDC scientists, asking the question, is ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis, a subset of AIDS, or is AIDS a subset of ME? Because the cases of both diseases were exploding simultaneously. And this is yet to be resolved. But, and there are many theories about why this may have been. ME is an older disease than AIDS. I think the first reported outbreak of ME occurred in possibly as long ago as 1906, but there was a huge outbreak of it in 1934 in Los Angeles in a hospital. Right up until the late 70s, early 80s, most of what was known about ME were isolated reports coming from all over the world, Reykjavik, Iceland, New Zealand, etc., outbreaks that were contained in hospital settings or convents, literally. In other words, I'm blanking.
Communities.
They were discrete outbreaks that were self-contained. There weren't a lot of people coming and going. It never broke out into the general population, is what I'm trying to say here. And these reports were known about. There were, a handful of doctors and scientists who were extremely interested in the disease, and they were like a sort of a gentleman's, butterfly society or something. They sort of all knew each other. They were just a small group of them, and that's not true of AIDS. AIDS was really new and emerged in the late 70s and kind of exploded in the 80s, and ME did at the same time. And
another suspect in the etiology of ME is another potential culprit was polio vaccines.
Well, certainly I'm familiar with that, the hypothesis about the polio vaccine. But I think that when you start talking about epidemiology in this disease, how did it spread? How did it get so huge? You always have to come back to what is the most rational explanation. Now, the polio vaccine hypothesis has never really been proven. It's interesting to think about, but basically something happened. The point is that not everybody, you have to think what affected everybody who got ME. Some people say, it's a combination of toxins in the environment and stress. Just make up anything you want because so many people have. But not everybody with ME has been exposed to chemicals, toxic chemicals. Not everybody with ME is under stress. These things don't really, in the end, they don't add up. The only thing that truly makes sense, and there's a lot of epidemiological evidence to support it, is that there's one infectious agent that causes ME. And just as there's one infectious agent that causes tuberculosis, one infectious agent that causes syphilis, it's not some big stew or some combination of things that produces this extremely discrete disease that's unlike any other disease. And so the big question becomes, what happened in the 1970s and really mostly in the 1980s to cause this explosion? Now, I'll propose a hypothesis here that is very, is going to make me extremely unpopular with a lot of people. Okay, put it that way. So here's one hypothesis. Maybe AIDS patients who were so severely immune suppressed and were, subject to these, formerly obscure infections like pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, a bird flu in effect. And there was a whole slew of infections that were considered AIDS-defining infections. And there was concern that AIDS patients might be sort of a population that would actually spread diseases like tuberculosis into the general population because they were so vulnerable, because their immune systems were so depleted. And it could be that the ME virus, which had been floating around, but was a really rare, obscure virus and needed certain conditions to thrive. It could be that AIDS patients picked up the ME virus too, along with all the other obscure and not so obscure viruses that they were infected with. And that in that way, they served as a vector to spread the ME virus into the general population. And also, that would be an opportunity for many different variants of the ME virus to spread. Now, again, having said that, I'm probably going to be shot dead in the streets tomorrow, but it's one theory. It's one theory. I've talked about this.
Let me, not to pick on vaccines, and for those of you who are listening to this and say, well, it couldn't have been a polio vaccine in 1934 because the Sabin and Salk vaccine did not exist before 1953. There was actually an experimental polio vaccine that was given for the first time in 1934, and the experimental test took place in this hospital in Los Angeles. And that was kind of the first major epidemic that people saw of the symptoms of what we now call chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME. I'm just going to give you this anecdote. Just before the release of the first mass vaccination program with the Salk vaccine, Bernice Eddy, who was a NIH scientist, one of the top scientists, most awarded, probably the top woman scientist at that time, most awarded in United States history, discovered a monkey virus in the vaccine. The vaccine was grown on a substrate of monkey kidney tissue, and they didn't know it then, but a lot of the African monkeys and Asian monkeys had viruses that could not be detected at that time. This one virus, which is called simian virus 40, it's called 40 because they found 39 before that. This virus causes cancer. In fact, it's used in laboratories today by scientists who want to induce cancer in guinea pigs. It literally causes them to sprout tumors. Bernice Eddy found this in the polio vaccine, reported it to her bosses at NIH. She was silenced, punished, her career was destroyed, and they went ahead and distributed this contaminated vaccine to 98 million people, including me. My whole generation got it. But the SV40 virus was not just confined. So that virus, which was a monkey virus, was harmless to monkeys. It had reached stasis and equilibrium with them where it no longer harmed them. But when given to humans or other animals, it causes cancer explosions. That virus is now throughout the entire human population because it was given in 2 vaccines for a limited number of time, but it got into the blood supply. And I suppose it might be possible that some virus at that time in history, if this is a viral disease, that virus could have also become ubiquitous in the blood supply. And of course, we don't know about it.
I think there was an excellent book written on this topic, the Simian 40. And
many books. It's not controversial. Nobody denies it. People
right. I agree. And I think that there have been people who have proposed this as one explanation for the pandemic of ME. I don't think it's been pursued beyond just proposing it. But I think, again, you have to come back to what makes the most sense, what is the most rational explanation. And regarding that, you have to think about the timing. Again, this was a very obscure and rare disease prior to the middle 1980s. When I began reporting on this in early 1986, I called the director she was in charge of public health, actually, and infectious diseases at the LA County Health Department. Her name was Shirley Fannin. She was an excellent public health officer. And I called her up, and before I could even get 20 words out about this disease, she said, I know exactly what you're talking about. And she said, frankly, there is no other problem or disease about which we get more phone calls, more so than AIDS. And she said, I'm afraid we may have another tiger by the tail. In other words, another epidemic. And she said, we're inundated with phone calls from patients and doctors on this disease. We have no money to spend on it. All the money is going to AIDS. And I will also mention there were other very famous outbreaks that were occurring around this period as well, that I wrote about in my book, Osler's Web, years ago. You still have to come back to what happened to set off this explosion of cases. And I'm not sure. I mean, I think the vaccine issue you're talking about with the simian vaccine is, very, very interesting and needs more research. But I'm not sure that it explains what happened during this time period when this virus, this disease, went from virtually 0 to 90 in the space of a few years. Now there's a scientist at the University of San Diego who has done a lot of research on this. He has indicated that, his name is Robert Navia, by the way, for anyone who's curious. He's indicated that cases of ME have increased 60-fold since 1985. And the conservative estimate right now is that 1% of the world's population has this disease. That is shocking and appalling to think that 1 out of every 100 people is suffering from this absolutely devastating, disabling disease. And if we want, we can get into the way the federal government, health agencies, and even the FDA is working in concert with CDC and NIH, and has been for decades now, to suppress information about this disease, to suppress funding, so that, so many very prominent epidemiologists, virologists, immunologists, biostatisticians, et cetera, who've wanted to work on this disease, who have been able to get grants from NIH for millions of dollars, in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars over their career, but who were shot down on their attempts to get a grant to study ME, and they left the field. And this has left a very, over the years, this has been so discouraging to scientists who've been interested that, nobody really wants to touch this. And because it's almost impossible to get funding, and the tiny amounts that are available to do the research, or to fund research that come from the NIH, they're in amounts that normally are called fairy dust funding at NIH. In other words, some years there's been $3 million to study ME. Currently, as of this year, they're proposing the next fall that they'll fund 3 centers, 3 scientists, to the tune of $7 million a year. And anything under like 10 million or 15 million at NIH is considered fairy dust. Literally, that's rounding up. Those are rounding up numbers. That's how small the money is.
This is a chronic problem because NIH has a budget of $42 billion a year. This is money it gives to scientists. It's supposed to study the origins, the etiology of the diseases that are injurious to the American people, but they don't do that. What they do is they develop drugs in partnership with the pharmaceutical industry, and they do studies that are harmless and easy to publish. The problem with a disease like this is whatever's causing it is almost certainly emblematic of a failure of government regulation. So if it's being caused by a toxic chemical, it's going to be glyphosate, it's going to be neonicotinoid pesticides, it's going to be any of the other chemicals that became ubiquitous in the 1970s, PFOAs or PFASs, flame retardants, Teflon. These are all made by huge and very powerful chemical manufacturers who control congressional committees that write the budgets for NIH, so they won't go near it. The even worse possibility is that this is vaccine related, and the vaccines actually increased in the coterminous with this time period. So we went from 3 vaccines in the 1960s to by 1980, today we have 72 vaccines that are mandated, 72 doses of 16 vaccines. And the big change happened in the 1980s, the DTP, the MMR vaccine, the hepatitis B, the Hib vaccines, all of these vaccines. And if any of them contain viruses, and many of them are grown on the tissue of monkeys or other animals that have viruses, that could jump to humans if they're injected into them. And it's a scary thing for NIH regulators to consider that they may be causing these chronic diseases.
Gosh, there's so much you just said. Let me respond by saying first that as a journalist at Life magazine, I covered Love Canal. And I probably spent 3 or 4 months in the Love Canal neighborhood. And I was just astonished at how poorly the state health department and the Centers for Disease Control responded to that problem. That was my inculcation, shall we say, into the world of toxic chemicals. And for a while, I also felt that virtually every problem, every medical problem in the world could be ascribed to toxic chemicals. However, coming back to ME, I want to give you just a little pushback on what you're saying, all due respect, which is that, again, thinking rationally about this disease, which, as I've said, is very discreet. A lot is known about it. It's not like any other disease, and it's been written about since the turn of the last century. So to prove that, for instance, the chemicals you mentioned that were so prominent, became prominent in the late 70s into the 80s, you'd have to prove that everyone with ME had been exposed to those chemicals. And that's not true. They weren't all exposed to those chemicals. Plus,
or pesticides that worked upon the same biological pathways. Like, for example, the copper-based pesticides that they used in the 1900s, which were coterminous with the polio outbreaks, operate on the same biological pathways as DDT, which later replaced them. And I'm not making this argument, Hillary. I'm just saying this is just a process that you go through where you have to say, okay, what are the exposures that fit the criteria, where you have every demographic exposed, suddenly showing this disease in the 1970s, what could be the culprits? What became ubiquitous throughout the population during that period? And it doesn't mean that there weren't smaller levels of the same chemical or similar chemicals before. It means something caused that explosion. And, we have to look for biological exposure because the genes don't cause epidemics. You need an environmental toxin or you need a microbe.
Well, I think you mentioned genes, and I'll just insert here the fact that there's been a lot of speculation and theories tossed out about genetic genes in relation to ME. And there's simply no evidence whatsoever that there's any kind of genetic link to having ME. In other words,
but NIH, that's what NIH loves to do. They love to look for a genetic cause to every disease. And it's oxymoronic because genes do not cause epidemics. If it's an epidemic, it has to be an environmental toxin. That gene can provide the vulnerability, but it's not going to be the thing that makes you sick. It leads to a whole epidemic. But NIH loves to pump money, just throw money down that rat hole because they keep all these scientists employed and they know they're never going to come up with an answer. That's what they do with autism. They're constantly, they've got billions and billions routed into studying the genetic cause of autism and zero into looking at vaccines. They don't want to find out.
I couldn't agree more about the genetic search for the link to what's the genetic search for autism. It's ridiculous. If you know how much money had been wasted on looking at genetic issues in ME, I totally agree with you. The genetic links that's an avenue that it needs to end. But I'm still going to give you a little pushback on toxic chemicals, even though for many years I was obsessed with toxic chemicals and I thought they were the answer to everything. But I've kind of moved over into a new area.
Yeah, and by the way, you don't have to push back because I don't believe it's a toxic chemical either. I think it's viral. That's my core belief. I can't support it. And the question is, how do you amplify kind of a viral epidemic? How do you cause one? One of the ways you do that is by vaccinating an entire population with the virus. And that could be it too, but I have no scientific basis for that. It's just a process of elimination. It has to be one of a certain category of causes that became ubiquitous in the 1970s. That's all you have to find. That's all I'm saying. I'm not naming a culprit. I'm saying there is a limited universe of what can be causing this, and we should identify those 20 or 30 causes and then eliminate them with science one at a time. That's what NIH ought to be doing, and it will never, you and I know, it will never do those studies.
No, it will never do those studies. But let me just say that there is so much evidence for infection in this disease. The immunology of ME absolutely screams infection. Every abnormality in the immune system that you look at in this disease, it suggests there's an antigen present. And the response of the immune system is exactly what you would see when there's an infection. And yet, in every other infectious disease, scientists at the NIH say, oh my gosh, there's an infection. Look, we can see by the immune system. In ME, it's sort of like, oh, that's very interesting. I wonder how the psychology managed to change the immune system in this way. I mean, every single important finding immunologically and in every other aspect of the disease, abnormal brain findings, et cetera, are just sloughed off as if they're nothing. I mean, you always have to come back. And regarding the vaccines, yes, I'm with you on the fact that there was plethora of vaccines, and it's horrifying to think about the number of vaccines that infants get these days. But on the other hand, you have to, when you're talking about ME, you have to think, well, what was the common denominator? What are the risk factors? And the only risk factors that we know so far for ME is, first of all, being human, number two, being female, number three, having contact with another person with ME. There's a long history of cluster outbreaks of ME, by which I mean, epidemics. How do you define? The definition is a time-space clustering. In other words, lots of people getting sick with the same thing at the same time. There's tremendous evidence of that, long history of that with ME. So,
Hillary, we're going to have to sign off. I just wanted to mention one other subject, which you go into a lot, which we didn't get a chance to talk about today. And it would be wrong for us to end this podcast without mentioning it, which is the way that the medical system tortures people who have this diagnosis, of gaslighting them, of dismissing them, of running them, making them pariahs. And these people who are enduring, mainly women, this terrible, terrible suffering, and it just compounds it. We need to mention that. And I want to thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Okay, I'm just going to add a couple more comments to this. To her credit, she pushes back on the toxins. I mean, if you know of anyone in a metropolitan area or even in industrial England, humans have been living amongst toxins and chemicals for well over 100 years, maybe even less so now than they used to back then, when kids would have to go to the factory to make a little bit of extra money for the family. And she is appropriately focusing on when this surge occurred. Now, I just did a few texts to Jonathan Cooey just to get a few of his thoughts here. There's a lot of argument about the cause, and there's a assumption that there's going to be an underlying common cause, an agent, a virus, a chemical, or something such as that. And, I mean, that's what we're supposed to do. If a lot of people have a certain illness, what's the underlying cause? But people are looking at, there's ways, there's common ways that the people can be afflicted with this illness, where it would be highly varied and it would be hard to pick up on it. Now, it would be incorrect. And again, now I'm adding a little bit more to the video. I should be, as an archivist, just posting this as it is. But Robert F. Kennedy himself, in a very sloppy way, did highlight that there was a major surge in vaccines used, and he should have been clear that vaccine count was for children. But yes, there are more vaccines now available and suggested than just about ever before. It's in the 70s. If you include boosters, it's probably a different number right now. That's correct. Most of those, not all though, but many are injected. So the quantity of intramuscularly injected foreign material is vastly higher since the 1970s and 1980s than it ever was before. And there's still a lot of unknowns about exactly what is in all of those. I mean, was everyone, once that needle goes in, people have different size muscles. It could, you don't know exactly how much is going to stay in the muscle, how much is going to get into a vein. The accuracy, the precision of which the vaccine itself is manufactured, what's it manufactured from, the dosing. There's so much variability that it's possible that there could be many people who are fine with that, and there are some people who are, have bad days, bad doctor, more sensitive, and the nature of the injury is not very specific. It's sort of like if you hear that someone was hit by a bullet, or in our current society that just loves to focus on guns being the only cause. Someone had a knife thrown at them. Okay, now maybe hit them in the arm, maybe it cut off a finger, maybe it scraped their skin, maybe it hit them in the leg, maybe it hit them in the chest. Okay. If you simply look, or maybe it missed them, so trying to identify, what's the common cause without ever just saying maybe it's the knife throwing, is you're going to get a huge variability in symptoms. And if you don't if you're looking for the environmental causes of bleeding, the environmental causes of a sharp protrusion into the chest, you're never going to find it. But if everyone is simply subjected to having a knife thrown in their general direction, you'd have a hard time figuring out exactly what the common cause is. Maybe it's the idiot who's throwing knives at everybody in this case. And a potential cause like that just never surfaces. I, of course, am very skeptical right now of everyone. Everyone should be a little bit skeptical in this space of everybody. But let's give credit when credit's due, okay? She is pushing back. She's trying to find something. She's definitely sold on what changed. And because Hillary Johnson is working under this premise that, well, the vaccines or polio vaccines have been around for a while, well before the 1970s. Toxins have been around for a while. Something must have changed in the 1970s. And she hasn't considered the fact that, well, there's a lot more intramuscular injection than ever before. Way more. And that can, just like have someone having a knife thrown in their general direction, that can manifest itself in all kinds of different ways. So they're looking for something very precise in terms of a virus, but maybe it's a very precise operation or procedure such as an intramuscular injection that never surfaces. So either she is aware that that could be a possibility and simply has a job to never mention it, or she's just not there. Because unless you are lucky enough, such as myself, to have a PhD friend, an associate, who has done more work than anyone could ever fathom, and has come to this realization that intramuscular injection seems to be a common point of a lot of this stuff, no pun intended, you wouldn't get there. Most people can't get there. You need to lean a little bit on some other people. You're going to look at hundreds, if not thousands, of other books. They'll never mention this. In fact, the quotes from Hillary Kaprowski about intramuscular, he didn't say intramuscular injection specifically, but he was concerned that rabies vaccines were causing reactions that were very polio-like because of being injected, and that's why he made an oral polio vaccine. I would have just glossed right over that, unless I already had someone say, hey, maybe it's the injecting into the muscle thing that's the problem. So I think it's important. And for some reason, Hillary Johnson is the person that wrote the forewords in Judy Mikovits' book. What's Judy Mikovits doing? She's looking at chronic fatigue, HIV, trying to find the common cause. Judy Mikovits is nearly certain that it's a virus. So you could see how Judy Mikovits' hypothesis very much aligns with what Hillary Johnson still suspects, at least as of 2 or 3 years ago. Must be a virus. There must be something common that's spreading. Judy Mikovits will never say, maybe it's the intramuscular injection that's causing this. Heck, if you go back, if you look at the wide variety of things which were falling under infantile paralysis, okay, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you're going to see a lot of similarities there. So, Bobby here is incredibly unimpressive, at best, in his questioning. Of course, they bring up the Dr. Mary's monkey book, this pile of trash, which every page that I open I can destroy. But maybe I'll get to that someday. I don't know. Maybe not. I mean, I opened up one page. It took me like half an hour to figure out that Bernice Eddy's husband died suspiciously and was at the FDA. Amazing. This person dedicated their whole life to this, and all they can do is continuously mention Lee Harvey Oswald. Somehow is behind every crazy conspiracy. Probably Lee Harvey Oswald, space aliens, pyramids, and Epstein can pretty much, I guess, be the answer to every conspiracy that ever happened. Anyways, her name is going to be prominent, and I think everyone that winds up on this podcast, especially the Bobby, he's running HHS right now. Why? And in my program right now, going forward, the name Hillary Johnson is going to be mentioned frequently. So that's why I wanted to share this. Also strange that female. Why female? That's interesting. Males can get this too, right? And also the lack of specificity. It's a little bit like autism. You just throw everything into this basket of autism. Maybe there is an underlying cause that unites a lot of things, or maybe autism is meant to be so confusing that it includes people that are injured in other unrelated ways. So you'll never get to the truth of it. Of course, as we know right now they're saying that it's Tylenol use as a baby that is behind all this stuff. So, oh well. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. Now it's in the record. Take care. Have a great morning. May do another one later. God bless.